This clip comes from an episode of the reality show Wife Swap back in 2008. In it, a mom breaks down in tears after seeing just how strict the other family's house rules are. But what no one knew back then is that this episode would later become chilling proof of how a picture-perfect family could end up turning on itself in the most shocking way. While every parent has their own style of raising kids and keeping their home in order, I'm really curious to know what you'll think about these parents after watching this. Trust me, their way of doing things turned out to be far more extreme than anyone ever expected. The family we'll be talking about is the Stockdale family, a family of 6 who lived on a quiet, isolated farm that many across America once watched with fascination. In the 2008 episode of ABC's Wife Swap, viewers got what looked like a glimpse into simpler times. A family living on an Ohio farm, making music together, and following strict religious rules that banned television, the internet, and even dating. The parents, Timothy and Catherine Stockdale, believed this strict lifestyle was their way of offering protection through purity, a conscious effort to shield their 4 sons from what Catherine called the contamination of modern society. The cameras showed nothing but smiles, a wholesome family playing bluegrass music in perfect harmony, with polite kids who always said, "Yes, ma'am," and "No, sir." Calvin, the oldest, played the mandolin. Charles took care of the upright bass. Jacob brought the fiddle to life, while James, the youngest, strummed the guitar. Along with their parents, they performed at churches, county fairs, and small-town events all over northeastern Ohio. They called themselves the Stockdale Family Band, and their songs carried messages about faith, family, and old-fashioned values. But if you're a normal viewer watching this, you could probably sense that something wasn't right, that these boys were bound to break. The Stockdale home ran on a set of rules so strict it controlled nearly every part of their lives. In one episode, the visiting mom even questioned Timothy about how his sons weren't allowed to think or decide anything for themselves. No television meant no exposure to news, entertainment, or perspectives beyond their parents' carefully curated worldview. No internet eliminated any possibility of unsupervised learning or communication with peers. No dating prevented the natural adolescent exploration of relationships and identity. Even their music came with restrictions. Only bluegrass and gospel were acceptable. Nothing contemporary, nothing that might introduce ideas their parents hadn't pre-approved. The Wife Swap episode itself ended up showing just how intense the Stockdale family's dynamics really were. In one scene, even the kids from the other family noticed how harsh and controlling Catherine's rules were. They understood the idea of wanting to raise responsible kids, but felt she didn't need to control every single thing her children did to make that happen. Years later, forensic psychologists reviewing the case would identify these restrictions as potentially creating what they termed developmental arrest, a state where normal psychological growth becomes stunted by excessive control. Dr. Patricia Williams, who testified during competency hearings, explained, "When children aren't allowed to make choices, even small ones, they never develop the psychological mechanisms for handling autonomy. It's like a muscle that atrophies from lack of use." Meanwhile, Timothy Stockdale, the patriarch, maintained his family's lifestyle through a combination of religious conviction and practical control. He managed the finances, made the major decisions, and served as the band's booking agent and leader. His word was law in the household, delivered with the authority of someone who believed he was following God's own design for family life. You see, the boys weren't just homeschooled. They were systematically isolated from any influence their parents couldn't directly manage. Church attendance was mandatory, but socializing afterward was limited. They could perform at community events, but couldn't develop friendships with other teenagers they met there. A youth pastor from their church, David Mitchell, later told investigators, "The boys would show up, perform beautifully, then immediately pack up and leave. No hanging around, no youth group participation, nothing that might lead to unsupervised conversation." Jacob, the third son, seemed to internalize these restrictions more deeply than his brothers. Where Calvin and Charles eventually found ways to leave, pursuing education and work opportunities that took them away from the farm, Jacob remained. Friends from their church later told investigators that Jacob rarely spoke unless spoken to, always deferring to his parents even in casual conversation. At 25, he still lived at home, still followed every rule, still played his fiddle in the family band as if frozen in the role he'd occupied since childhood. Sarah Henderson, who attended the same church, recalled an incident from 2015. I asked Jacob about his favorite television show, forgetting they didn't watch TV. He looked panicked, like I'd asked him to commit a crime. He just kept repeating, "We don't do that," until his mother came over and changed the subject. His younger brother James represented something different. At 21, James had started showing signs of wanting more from life. He'd been accepted to college for the fall of 2017, planning to study music, but also to experience the world beyond the farm's boundaries. Church members remembered James as the most outgoing of the Stockdale boys, the one who could actually maintain a conversation, who might even crack a joke when his parents weren't within earshot. The contrast between the brothers had become more pronounced in the months before the murders. James had secretly gotten a cell phone, hidden in his room where his parents wouldn't find it. Investigators would later discover text messages between James and a friend from church, discussing his plans for college, his dreams of joining a contemporary Christian band, his growing frustration with the limitations placed on his life. In one message dated May 20th, 2017, James wrote, "I love my family, but I can't breathe here anymore." This divergence between the two brothers still living at home would become crucial to understanding what happened that June afternoon. While James looked toward a future of possibilities, Jacob seemed trapped in a present that offered no escape from the rigid structure that had defined his entire existence. And on June 15th, 2017, Timothy wasn't home. He'd driven 20 miles away to perform at an agricultural event, leaving Catherine to maintain the household routine. It was a Thursday, which meant instrument practice from 2 to 4 p.m., followed by dinner preparation and evening devotions. The schedule had been the same for over a decade, as rigid and predictable as everything else in the Stockdale home. But on that day, something shifted. Something this news would soon explain.
Investigators here in Stark County are trying to figure out what led up to the deaths of a mother and son and why another son may be responsible. Those two brothers and another two brothers, as well as their father, are a part of a bluegrass band. You may have heard of them, the Stockdale family band. And the oldest brother releasing a statement overnight saying, "We are mourning the loss of my brother and mother and are waiting to learn more about what happened yesterday afternoon." The Stark County Sheriff's Office says someone at the Beach City home called 911 around 4:30 and hung up. Deputies arrived about 20 minutes later, finding 21-year-old James Stockdale and his mother, Catherine Stockdale, dead. Investigators think 25-year-old Jacob Stockdale may be responsible. He was life-flighted to Metro with a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Years ago, the Stockdales were featured on the ABC reality show Wife Swap, showcasing their simple life and strict rules.
The physical evidence found at the Stockdale farm told a story that contradicted everything neighbors thought they knew about this family. Shell casings from a 20-gauge shotgun were recovered from 2 locations in the house. Blood spatter analysis indicated Catherine had been shot first, in the kitchen where she'd likely been preparing the evening meal. The coroner's report showed she died instantly from a close-range blast to the head, fired from approximately 3 feet away. There were no defensive wounds, suggesting she hadn't seen the attack coming. James was found near the staircase, suggesting he'd either been coming to investigate the first shot or trying to escape after witnessing his mother's death. His wounds indicated he'd been shot while in motion, the pellet pattern showing he'd been turning away when struck. The medical examiner, Dr. Michael Torres, testified that James had lived for perhaps 30 seconds after being shot, long enough to crawl several feet toward the front door before succumbing to blood loss. The shotgun belonged to Timothy Stockdale, kept for farm use but accessible to all family members. It was normally stored in an unlocked cabinet in the mudroom, loaded in case of problems with coyotes threatening the chickens. Ballistics testing confirmed it was the only weapon used. There were no signs of forced entry, no indication of struggle before the shootings, no evidence that anyone besides the 3 victims had been in the house. The Stark County Sheriff's Office had to confront an uncomfortable conclusion. This violence had come from within the family itself. Detective Mark Patterson, lead investigator on the case, noted in his report, "The scene was remarkably contained. No overturned furniture except for a single chair in the kitchen. No signs of an argument or prolonged confrontation. The shooter knew exactly what he intended to do and acted quickly." Jacob's survival complicated the investigation. The trajectory of his self-inflicted wound suggested he'd held the shotgun under his chin, but the angle had been slightly off, sending the shot through his jaw and skull without destroying the brainstem. Paramedics found him conscious but unable to speak, bleeding profusely, but somehow still alive. The medical examiner would later testify that a quarter-inch difference in angle would have been fatal. During those first critical hours, while Jacob underwent emergency surgery at Akron General Medical Center, investigators processed every inch of the Stockdale home. They found no last note, no journal expressing violent thoughts, no internet history that might explain the sudden eruption of violence because, of course, the Stockdales didn't have internet. The family computer, used only for homeschooling materials and music notation, contained nothing relevant. What they did find were handwritten letters James had been drafting to his parents, hidden beneath his mattress. In them, he expressed his desire for independence while reassuring them of his continued faith. One unfinished letter dated June 10th read, "I know you think college will corrupt me, but I need to find my own way to serve God. Please understand this isn't rejection of everything you taught me. It's trying to become who God wants me to be." Timothy Stockdale's alibi was airtight. Multiple witnesses placed him at the agricultural event, performing on stage at the exact time of the shootings. Cell phone records confirmed his location. Security footage from the venue showed him loading equipment at 3:45 p.m., 25 minutes before the first 911 call. When investigators reached him by phone, his shock seemed genuine. He drove back to Beach City with a sheriff's deputy, asking repeatedly how this could have happened, insisting Jacob would never hurt anyone. But investigators discovered something Timothy hadn't known. Jacob had recently expressed interest in leaving home. Church members reported quiet conversations where Jacob had asked about apartment rentals, about how to apply for jobs, about what it was like to live independently. Robert Chen, who ran a local music store, told investigators about an encounter with Jacob just 2 weeks before the murders. He came in alone, which was unusual. Normally, his father was with him. He asked about guitar lessons, said he wanted to learn something besides fiddle. When I offered to set something up, he got scared and left. It was like he'd been caught doing something forbidden. The psychiatric evaluation of Jacob, conducted once he'd recovered enough to communicate, revealed a young man caught between 2 impossibilities. He couldn't imagine staying in the life his parents had constructed, but he also couldn't imagine leaving it. Dr. Rebecca Foster, the court-appointed psychiatrist, described severe anxiety around decision-making and pathological fear of disappointing authority figures. When asked why he'd shot his family members, Jacob's only response was that he had to make it stop, though he couldn't articulate what it was. The evaluation sessions, conducted over several months in 2018, painted a picture of someone who'd never developed a sense of self separate from his family's expectations. Jacob couldn't name a single personal preference that wasn't aligned with what his parents had taught him. When asked what kind of food he liked, he responded with what his mother had always cooked. When asked about his dreams for the future, he could only repeat what his parents had planned for him. The family's appearance on Wife Swap became evidence itself. Prosecutors obtained the full footage, not just what aired, but also the hours of raw material that never made it to broadcast. In scene after scene, Catherine spoke about protecting her children from corruption, while the boys sat silently in the background, their expressions unreadable. At one point, when asked what he wanted to do when he grew up, teenage Jacob had looked to his mother before answering, "Whatever God and my parents think is best." Production assistant Michelle Harper, who worked on the wife swap episode, provided a statement to investigators. "Most kids on the show are excited about the cameras, want to show off a little. The Stockdale boys were different. They only spoke when directly asked a question, and even then, they'd look at their parents first. It was like watching robots programmed to give specific responses." The other Stockdale brothers, Calvin and Charles, provided crucial context. Both had left home as soon as they reasonably could, Calvin at 19 and Charles at 20. They described a household where questioning parental decisions was treated as questioning God himself. Charles told investigators about the guilt he still carried for pursuing his own path, how his parents had made him feel like he was betraying not just them, but his eternal salvation. Calvin's testimony was particularly revealing. "When I told them I wanted to go to college, my mother cried for 3 days. My father said I was choosing the world over God. They made me feel like I was destroying the family. I almost stayed because of the guilt, but I knew if I didn't leave then, I never would." They also revealed something that hadn't been public knowledge. The family's financial situation had become precarious. The band's bookings had declined as the boys grew older and the novelty wore off. Timothy had been talking about needing Jacob and James to contribute more to household expenses, even as he refused to let them pursue any work that might take them away from the family's musical ministry. The pressure to maintain their lifestyle while keeping the boys under complete control had been building for months. Financial records subpoenaed during the investigation showed the family was 3 months behind on their mortgage. The band's income had dropped from $30,000 annually in 2010 to less than $8,000 in 2016. Timothy had been exploring selling the farm, but Catherine had resisted, viewing it as their sanctuary from the corrupting world. Meanwhile, Jacob's recovery took months. The physical healing was actually faster than the psychological process of becoming capable to stand trial. Multiple competency hearings were held between 2018 and 2021, with psychiatric experts disagreeing about whether Jacob truly understood the charges against him. His attorneys argued for an insanity defense, citing the extreme isolation and control he'd experienced throughout his life. The legal proceedings were complicated by Jacob's inability to assist in his own defense. During early hearings, he would simply agree with whatever was said, whether it came from prosecutors or his own attorneys. Dr. Amanda Richards, testifying for the defense, stated, "Jacob has no framework for independent thought. He spent 25 years being told what to think, what to feel, what to want. Asking him to suddenly participate in adversarial proceedings is like asking someone who's never seen water to swim." But in December 2021, something shifted. Jacob decided to plead guilty to 2 counts of murder, accepting a sentence of 30 years to life rather than risk a trial that might result in the death penalty. During the plea hearing, he spoke only briefly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I wish I could take back what I've done. I loved my mother and brother. I don't understand what happened to me that day." The prosecutor, Dennis Barr, later said it was one of the most difficult cases he'd handled, not because of any question about guilt, but because the motive remained so opaque. Usually in a murder case, you can point to something: money, anger, jealousy, something. Here, it seems like 25 years of pressure just exploded in 14 minutes of violence. The Stockdale murders forced uncomfortable conversations in Beach City and beyond about the line between protection and control in raising children. Local churches began hosting discussions about mental health, acknowledging that faith alone might not address every psychological struggle. The homeschooling community, which had often held up the Stockdales as an example of success, grappled with questions about isolation and socialization, Pastor William Edwards of Beach City Methodist Church organized a series of community meetings in the months after the murders. We had to confront the fact that we'd all seen this family struggling in some way, but we'd mistaken control for discipline, isolation for devotion. We failed them by not asking harder questions. Timothy Stockdale never returned to the farm. He sold the property and moved away from Ohio, declining all interview requests. The Stockdale family band's instruments were quietly auctioned, their recordings removed from the church websites that had once featured them prominently. The only public statement Timothy ever made was a brief note asking for privacy and prayers. The two surviving brothers, Calvin and Charles, established a memorial fund in their mother and youngest brother's names, directing money toward mental health services for young adults from restrictive religious backgrounds. They've spoken carefully about their experiences, emphasizing that while they don't blame their parents' faith, they recognize how the extreme application of control in the name of protection created an environment where tragedy became possible. In a rare public statement in 2022, Charles Stockdale said, "Our parents loved us in the only way they knew how." But love without freedom becomes a prison, and faith without questions becomes dangerous. We're trying to honor our mother and James by helping other families find balance before it's too late. Experts who studied the case identified it as an example of what they term enmeshment trauma, where family boundaries become so blurred that individual identity cannot develop normally. Dr. Sarah Chen, a forensic psychologist who reviewed Jacob's evaluation records, wrote, "When every thought, every desire, every moment of a person's life is subject to external control, the pressure builds like steam in a sealed container. Eventually, something has to give. The house where it happened still stands, though new owners have renovated it extensively. They report no strange occurrences, no ghostly music in the night, just the ordinary sounds of a farmhouse in rural Ohio. Occasionally, someone who remembers the Stockdales will drive by and remember the family that once made music there before everything went silent." Jacob Stockdale remains in custody at the Richland Correctional Institution. He's eligible for parole after 30 years, when he'll be 55 years old. Prison records indicate he participates in therapy sessions and has taken up drawing, an interest his mother never knew he had because he'd never been allowed to explore it. He doesn't play music anymore. Guards report he's a model prisoner, following every rule without question, the same pattern that defined his life before June 15, 2017. Now, this isn't the first time something like this has happened. There have been other cases where a child finally snapped after living under strict, harsh rules. Another well-known example is the Bever family, whose case became one of the most shocking family massacres in recent history.
Broken Arrow 911. Broken Arrow 911. Hello?
For most people, the safest place they could ever be is their home. And yet, for the Bever family of Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, their home became a torture cell and execution chamber. Their screams were heard from around the neighborhood, and police only found out because one of the victims called 911 for help. The caller is clearly a child, and he's just one of many children that died that day in a brutal act of violence. No guns were used during the assault. The assailants preferred a much more intimate method of murder, so they used knives to claim the 5 lives that were lost that day. This is the story of the Bever family, of the day half of its members were slaughtered like animals, and how a culture of glorifying violence contributed to their horrifying end. We're going to unpack how the perpetrators took inspiration from some of the most tragic mass killings in America and aspired to go further than any murderer had gone before. David and April Bever weren't exactly the most normal people. In fact, there was a lot about their life that many might find strange. According to the Broken Arrow community, nothing really stood out about the Bevers, but that's not because they were an everyday family. They were more like ghosts, seldom heard from and even more rarely seen. They interact with their neighbors only when necessary and chose to homeschool each of their 7 children. Their entire relationship was strikingly unusual. When they met in 1987, David was 24 years old and April was only 15 years old. The age gap didn't really get in the way of their relationship, though. They quickly settled down, and in the mid-90s, they got to work starting the big family they'd always wanted. The first child to come was Robert in 1996, followed by Michael in 1998. They became the older brothers to Crystal, Daniel, Victoria, and the baby Autumn, who was just about 2 years old at the time of the incident in 2015. It's possible that the Beavers started such a large family because they didn't want anything to do with the outside world. Their kids were forbidden from talking to anyone else in the neighborhood, and they spent almost all of their time at home. Their seclusion was so complete that some neighbors only found out the Beavers' family name after the incident took place. But even though the Beavers were uniquely antisocial, they weren't exactly backwards. David was a tech consultant for HP Enterprise Services, and while April was a stay-at-home mom, she regularly used Reddit under the username AOKMom. Her posting history shows how deeply she loved her children, how she thought they were perfect, and that she wouldn't trade them for the world. She also spoke about wanting to live near the mountains or the ocean, and that her home state of Oklahoma didn't have either of those things. Most importantly, April talked about how she wanted her children to be tech-savvy. She wanted them to learn about computers and potentially become web designers and coders someday. It's safe to say that the Beavers didn't restrict their kids from the ever-growing inflow of 21st century tech. But as it turns out, this molded their impressionable minds in unexpectedly dark ways. Since he wasn't allowed to go out much or make friends with kids in the neighborhood, Robert did what any kid growing up in the 21st century did: found a community online. Or, more accurately, he tried to find an online community. What he wanted more than anything else was to be famous. So he created a YouTube account in 2013, hoping to make it big.
Salute. Hey everyone, it's me, Cult Empire. In case you didn't know, you found me by accident, or you're expecting someone else. Why would you do that? Anyway, this is the second first ever update, which I think is a major improvement. I tried a news report theme last time. That's not very vloggy, is it? So I'm being a little more chillinated, writing stuff, scripting. I'm going to make my first skit soon. Can't show you a sneak preview or it would ruin it. It'll be like a minute long. It's going to be some good stuff. I think it's going to be hilarious.
On this YouTube channel, Robert talked about Minecraft, his opinions on society, and his plans to make more content in the future. Notably, the last video uploaded to this channel features his little brother Michael, with whom Robert had a special bond. They spent a lot of time together, much of it on the internet where they'd go through videos and developed an obsession of sorts with spree killings and mass murders like the Columbine massacre and the Aurora theater shooting. Robert would later say that his parents had extreme beliefs, which, if true, might have inspired him to idolize killers. According to him, his parents were full of hatred and couldn't wait for a biblical apocalypse so that they could get retribution for everything they despised in the world. It's possible that David and April were antisocial, but Robert and Michael certainly were. Neighbors reported that they tended to behave strangely. In one incident, Michael was found staring blankly at the people next door, and he wouldn't respond when called out to. Clearly, something terrible was going on underneath the surface, and there's a chance that David made it even worse. It's been alleged that he was both physically and verbally abusive to his children, though the extent of this hasn't been verified. We do know that one of the children confirmed that David had a violent streak, which seemed to suggest that Robert and Michael potentially learned a lot from their father in that regard. But at the same time, any abuse that took place didn't explain why Robert and Michael became so obsessed with brutal violence. Regardless of the why, the two brothers soon started fantasizing about committing acts of violence. They fantasized about shooting up schools, murdering people in their own homes, and going on killing rampages across their town. According to Robert, these fantasies were just a way for him to express his internal rage. They weren't meant to be taken seriously. And they definitely weren't blueprints for what he wanted to do in real life. But as we will soon reveal, these murderous ideations weren't just flights of fancy. Before too long, they became too intense for Robert to hold in. In 2014, Robert got a job at a religious call center. His parents, both of whom were very religious themselves, were overjoyed that their son was taking such an interest in their faith. What they didn't know was that the whole point of the job was to collect funds that would help Robert act out his violent fantasies. Michael, who had always looked up to his older brother, was involved from the very beginning. They wanted to do something big, something that would be put in the history books. They wanted to make the shooters at Columbine and Sandy Hook seem like rookies in comparison. Basically, they wanted to kill as many people as possible, and they eventually settled on 50 people. However, they couldn't just go out and start murdering random citizens. They needed to practice first, so that their killing spree would live up to all they wanted it to be. They also needed weapons and ammunition, so they started gathering it the first chance they got. By the summer of 2015, Robert and Michael had Kevlar vests, helmets, guns, and bullets. Robert had saved every single penny he could from the call center job, and it paid for the personal armory that could unleash hell on Broken Arrow in the blink of an eye.
Where were you going to go? I mean, where was going to be your mass plan to get the most people, the most bang for your buck?
We're just heading generally towards Washington State. We're going to do it statewide.
Did you guys have, like, were you going to go, I mean, who else were you going to kill? Just whoever you ran into?
Yeah, pretty much. We said 5 at a time, like gas stations, restaurants.
Okay, and then just keep going.
Yep.
The final piece of their murderous puzzle was a consignment of 3,000 rounds of ammunition. It was due to arrive on July 23rd, but there was a problem. Their parents would be understandably concerned if they saw their sons receiving thousands of bullets. This was something Robert and Michael wouldn't tolerate. And so, the murder of the Bever family was planned out for 2 reasons. Firstly, Robert and Michael needed to practice their craft before heading out on their real spree, and secondly, they had to make sure their parents were dead before the bullets arrived. The stage was set, and Robert and Michael were ready to put their plan into action. By the way, I post true crime and new cases here every day, so if that sounds like your kind of thing, please consider subscribing. It helps a lot. The perpetrators got ready to wipe out their family on July 22nd, 2015. Their sister, Crystal, had seen them wearing Kevlar vests and other types of body armor previously, and had told their mother about their weird behavior. However, April just told their daughter that boys will be boys, probably assuming that her sons were messing around. At around 11 p.m. on the night of the incident, Crystal got another sight of her brothers wearing tactical gear when she went to their bedroom. She was likely going to ask them to wash the dishes or perform some other chore before they went to bed. But she ended up walking in on them right as they were about to execute their plan. When Michael saw her, he asked Robert if they should go ahead with the plan now. Robert said yes, and the pair immediately started stabbing and slashing at their sister with large knives. They went so far as to slit Crystal's throat, but the 13-year-old girl's will to live was too great. Since they thought she was already dead, she slowly started crawling towards the front door. As she inched to freedom, she heard her mother screaming. Robert and Michael had started attacking their parents. David suffered 28 stab wounds to the neck, torso, head, and face. It was a brutal, unrelenting assault, the kind you'd expect from a wild animal, not a human being. However, what the perpetrators did to their mother was even more gruesome. April was stabbed nearly 50 times all across her body, but that's not how she died. A medical examiner later reported that she'd been killed by blunt force trauma to the head. This means that the homicidal brothers either stabbed her relentlessly before bashing her head in, or their hatred for her was so potent that they ravaged her corpse with their knives. By this point, Robert had noticed that Crystal had escaped. Her wounds were so severe that she'd collapsed outside, so Robert headed out and dragged her back in. This left a trail of blood on the driveway, something that would prove crucial later on.
Who else was in the bathroom?
I think Victoria might have been in there. About
Victoria?
Yeah, my 4-year-old sister.
4-year-old, okay.
There's no way to know exactly what happened next, but reports confirm that 7-year-old Christopher and 4-year-old Victoria were locked in the bathroom for their safety. Since they were far too young to be able to think of a plan like this, it's possible that their older brother Daniel told them to go in and lock the door behind him. He knew he had to do something. Anything to save his family. He didn't have time to think about why his brothers were slaughtering everyone he loved. Daniel headed to a phone as Robert dragged Crystal back into the house. Michael headed to the bathroom and knocked, asking the kids to open the door. There's a chance that Daniel had told him not to open the door for anyone, and the children did as their older brother and protector said. But Michael was the older brother too, and he was laser focused on his desire to kill everyone in the house except Robert. Michael started pretending that Robert was attacking him and begged the kids to open the bathroom door. Eventually, the innocent children, probably confused and disoriented by all the chaos, opened the door. They were killed instantly, with Christopher getting stabbed 21 times and Victoria receiving 23 stab wounds. While all of this was happening, April spoke her final words, shouting at Daniel to call 911. The 12-year-old hid himself in a bedroom and called the police. And despite how shaken he was able to quickly and efficiently describe the situation to the operator.
Hello?
Hello.
Hi, where are you at?
Broken Arrow, Oklahoma 7411.
What address?
709 Magnolia Court.
Okay. Are you the only one there?
No, my brother's attacking my family.
Your dad is attacking your family?
No, my brother. He has an idea stealing me. Oh, millions of people out.
Okay, who's attacking your family?
What?
Who's attacking your family?
Yes.
Who is it? Do they
I'll call them.
The call ends with what sounds like pleading from Daniel. It's possible that he was pleading with Michael as he raised the knife over his head. The pleas went unanswered, and Daniel suffered 21 stab wounds before he died. Overall, the Bever family was stabbed 150 times. The sheer physical exertion of the attack would have left Robert and Michael feeling utterly exhausted. That's when they heard the sounds of police sirens in the distance. Even though Daniel hadn't been able to provide details during the 911 call, the operator had heard enough to know that something was terribly wrong. She dispatched police officers to the scene, and when they arrived, they saw the blood that Crystal had left on the porch. They knocked on the door. Crystal, who was miraculously still alive, was able to weakly call out to the officers. They immediately broke down the door and headed inside, finding Crystal bleeding on the floor. It didn't take long for them to find the rest of the victims, along with 2-year-old Autumn, who'd somehow been spared. However, her survival wasn't the result of mercy from her brothers. Later reports revealed they intended to behead her, saving her as the last course in their grotesque homicidal buffet. But the police arrived before they could see their plan through. The 2 teen culprits fled out the back door and tried to hide in the woods behind the family home. More police arrived, and a canine unit was dispatched. The dogs caught the scent of the killers fairly quickly, and Robert and Michael were found hiding in a bush. Michael was quivering and afraid, but Robert was carrying a knife. Pictures taken of the culprits before they were booked show Michael looking absolutely miserable, but Robert has a smug smile on his face, as if this is what he'd wanted all along. Crystal was taken to the hospital where she had to undergo surgery while her brothers were taken to the police station. When he was interrogated, Robert apparently showed no signs of remorse. His interview has never been released to the public, but we do know that he talked about how he wanted to be famous and that was the sole motive behind the mass murder. Both brothers were charged with 5 counts of murder in the first degree, along with an additional count of assault with intent to kill. On July 6, 2016, while awaiting trial in custody, Robert tried to commit suicide by tying his bedsheet into a noose. Perhaps he'd deluded himself into thinking this was a romantic end to his supposedly heroic quest. As it turned out, the noose was ineffective, and Robert didn't experience any injuries from the attempt. He was placed on suicide watch, and the 2 brothers attended their separate trials. Robert had initially pleaded not guilty to the charges. After the suicide attempt, he changed his plea to guilty and was sentenced to 6 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. As for Michael, the judge determined that he should be tried as an adult. He initially tried to plead insanity, but he was eventually convicted on all counts as well, and received a sentence of 5 consecutive life terms plus 28 years. The brothers were jailed in separate facilities. Robert was sent to Joseph Harp Correctional Center, whereas Michael was sent to Lexington Correctional Center. The younger culprit showed a deteriorating state of mind, with inmates reporting that he made grotesque, violent drawings in crayon, possibly to make him seem tougher than he was. While in jail, Robert was diagnosed with a number of mental illnesses, many involving psychosis. Prison doctors theorized that he had major depressive disorder, borderline personality disorder, and post-traumatic stress disorder. They also prescribed him medication for schizophrenia. Based on how Robert has behaved in jail, all that medical attention doesn't seem to have had much of an effect. In 2019, he tried attacking prison staff with a makeshift shiv, indicating that his violent impulses haven't gone away. Crystal and Autumn, the sole survivors of the massacre, were eventually adopted by the same family. This was done to ensure they could stay together, something that might help them overcome the immense tragedy their brothers had put them through. As for the Bever family home, it fell into a state of disrepair as it sat vacant for years. No one wanted to buy a house where something so gruesome had occurred. It became a popular spot for ghost hunters and other fans of the macabre until it was destroyed in a fire on March 18, 2017. Just weeks after the city council made plans to buy it and demolish it. The cause of the fire remains unknown, but it's possible that someone wanted to rid Broken Arrow of this tragic reminder. 2 years later, Reflection Park was opened to honor the memory of the Bever family. The park contains a path that goes through a seemingly innocuous patch of grass, where the scene of the massacre once stood. It's highly likely that Crystal and Autumn changed their names to protect their privacy. All remnants of the Bever family, including their home, are now gone. So, what do you think of this case? Did Michael deserve to be tried as an adult, considering Robert was the mastermind? Or was he just as complicit in the murders? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you like the way we create these videos and you want to help bring more cases like this to light, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives. Thank you once again for watching.